So let me say one more time, if you just came in, that Jack Daniel injured himself, injured his leg and could not travel. So I have swapped filling in for him, a slightly different topic. So apologize for that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started because it is just about 1:45. And today's topic is building a secure foundation for converged IT and OT environments. So if you're in an industry that has OT and IT, I think this will be very worthwhile for you. If you're in banking, for example, and have no operational technology, then you might not be in the right place, and I won't be offended if you leave. But I do hope you stay, because I think we've got some really interesting things to talk about here. And I am talking about building a foundation. We're talking about some of the basic things. But first, let me introduce myself. There's my picture with even less hair. And I am a senior product marketing manager at Tenable, going on 5 years there, so been there a while. And I've been focused on security frameworks, on compliance for the last little bit over a year, been focused on the operational technology environment and how we can help there. And today we're going to talk about, I say, assume convergence. And I'm going to talk about what that is. But it's the fact that IT and OT systems are converging. And some people think that OT environments are completely air-gapped, they're completely isolated. And that may be the case in a few instances. But I really believe that that's the fringe. The trend is definitely towards integrating IT with OT. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Then we're going to talk about just some of the basics that you can do and get into building blocks around some basic controls that you need to get in place. And then we'll have questions and answers along the way. And what I think you will get out of it is, my goal is you'll have better protected IT and OT systems and fewer security incidents to investigate. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because I know a lot of times, in my opinion, people get really caught up in anomaly detection and threat hunting, and that's a good thing to do. But if you haven't put the basic controls in place first, then you're going to be spending a lot more time doing that than you should be. The analogy I think of is if you have a house and you've got flies in the house, and you pick up a fly swatter and go around and swat all the flies, you're going to be doing that and keeping yourselves really busy. What you need to do first is to make sure you've got screens on your windows, screens on your door, and that's going to prevent a lot of the anomalies that you need to go swat. Of course, some will get in, so you need to do that. But we're talking about the basic things, kind of securing the state of your IT and OT networks. And then the things that I'm going to be talking about, if you implement them, it's not just good security, it's good for operational technology as well, particularly when we get into things like building an asset inventory, knowing what you have. That way, if you have an outage, you know that, oh, okay, this device is this model number, and we need to go address it. Then another thing that's a little bit soft, I guess, is I say improved IT and OT security alignment. In a lot of organizations, these IT folks are very different from the OT folks. They have different priorities, they have different requirements, and sometimes they don't understand each other very well. So, is that an understatement?
That's absolute truth.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? So, at Tenable, most Friday mornings I come in and they've installed a patch on my computer. So the first thing I have to do is reboot my computer. And in IT, we kind of take that as, yeah, that's what happens in IT. In OT, availability and uptime is key. And rebooting and installing a patch is a huge no-no. In fact, they may have a maintenance window that's maybe every 6 months, every year, longer than that, and that's the only time you want to have any downtime whatsoever. I was talking to a fellow a few months ago, and he said that they were talking to the IT team, and they had this one programmable logic controller, and every third Thursday, they had to reboot it, and they didn't know why. They thought it was just some quirk in the device. And then they happened to talk to their security folks, and they found out that on Wednesday night, the security team was scanning for vulnerabilities, and the active scan knocked that device over. So that's an example of how IT environments are different from OT environments, the tools that you use, need to be different. But at the same time, the people need to work together and they need to align themselves. So I'll be talking about that a little bit, kind of give you some of my suggestions for how you can improve that alignment. This diagram is a representation of the Purdue Diagram, and it shows the different layers or different levels in a converged environment. So starting down at the bottom, I've got some robots there and motors and their pumps, all sorts of things. These are the actual physical things that control your physical process. And the next level up is the direct control layer, and that's where you have the programmable logic devices, the PLCs, the RTUs, and other things. And that's where these devices are taking data in all the time and making real-time decisions about what needs to be done to keep that process running the way it's supposed to be running. So that's the second layer. And then as you move up into the site supervisory layer, I know you really can't read that from here, but we have some things like an HMI or a human machine interface device. That would typically be a Windows computer, and an operator will be sitting and just overseeing the process. And in some cases, they might make some changes on that. And so even in the OT environment, you're seeing some IT devices. So this is a Windows-based computer. It's really running an operational technology function, but it's a Windows computer. And oftentimes you'll see some traditional IT network devices in this environment if they don't have to be hardened for a harsh environment. Then as you move up, you've got some other, still in the OT environment, site operations. You've got something like a historian, which is keeping track of everything that's going on, all the changes in the system. Again, that's probably a Windows-based machine. And these Windows-based machines may be running on bare iron, they may be running on virtual infrastructure. So you're starting to see, even in the OT environment, you have IT assets, so to speak. And then once you move up into the upper layers where you've got scheduling and things of that nature, it's really more of a traditional IT type of application. So the message here is that these things are blending together. In fact, that's what we call the IT-OT convergence. And there are lots of business reasons, depending on your specific industry, of why you're going to undertake some of these initiatives to do the convergence. It might be to increase sustainability or profitability, productivity. Maybe you want to innovate. If you're a manufacturing organization, you want to be able to be very responsive to changes in your manufacturing. I live in Portland, Oregon, and the reason I mention that is yesterday we had a power outage. And our house has, in fact, all of the houses in our area have a smart meter connected to it. So this smart meter is beaconing out all the time, giving status, and somehow that gets up to the mothership. I don't know exactly what route it takes. But when there's an outage, it's not beaconing up anymore. And so if you call the power company, they have my phone associated with my account, my address, and they will automatically, you're not even talking to a person, they say, you're experiencing an outage, it's impacting this many customers, and they also, if there are multiple outages, will figure out which outage has the most customers impacted, and that's the one they fix first. Unfortunately, not that you care, but my house is on a boundary, and there's 7 of us with above ground power. Everybody else has below power. So there are only 7 homes impacted when we have an outage typically. So guess who's the last one to get fixed? That would be us. But at any rate, they have these automated systems that are really improving that customer experience, giving us this information. This is, when it's expected to be fixed, call back if you want additional information. That's just an example of how these systems are all interconnected. And we could talk about lots of examples, but you'll just have to trust me that they're interconnected. I also want to share a little bit of research about OT being under attack. One of the things on this previous diagram where I showed all of those layers, oftentimes attackers come in through the IT environment. We know that there are lots of vulnerabilities. Last year, I think it was over 17,000 vulnerabilities were discovered. Most of them would be in this IT equipment. And then they can get credentials and pivot on down and do the nasty stuff in the OT layers. And so OT is under attack. There's an organization you may have heard of. They've been doing security research for a long time. It's called the Ponemon Institute, and they get quoted in articles and so on. And Tenable, we just hired them basically to do some research for us, and we haven't published it. The publication date will be next month. but I'm giving you a sneak preview here. And they said that, and we were looking at what we'd call OT sectors. So we're not talking about banking and finance. We're talking about utilities, manufacturing, things of that nature. And we had 721 people that were in that category, so a reasonable sample size, and 23% of them said they'd experienced a nation-state attack. And I have to tell you, that blew me away. I would have thought it would have been 2 to 3%. 23% to me is just amazing. So OT is under attack. And then the next one, 50% have experienced an attack against OT infrastructure that resulted in downtime. So that's pretty significant as well. I think they said in the past 24 months for these two, but still, that's very significant. And then one other thing I put in here, you'll see it's kind of a recurring theme, I'm going to come back to it, is only 20% said they had sufficient visibility into their attack surface. They don't really know what they have very well. And so they've got some blind spots. You know, the saying is, if you don't know what you have, you can't secure it. And that's very true. So that's some of the data from Ponemon Research. And then just a little bit more facts and figures before we move on. And this is, the thought here is that we're seeing that IT security people are being held responsible, not just for the IT security, but the IT and the OT security. That's happening more and more. And Gardner says by 2021, 70% of the OT security will be managed directly by the CIO, the CISO, or the CSO departments, up from 35% today. So that's really a trend where I think the executives in most organizations want one throat to choke. They want to be able to go to the CISO or whoever it is and say, you have responsibility for cybersecurity, not just over here, but here in the whole organization. A related thing is that they say due to a dearth of OT security skills, IT security teams are being asked to take ownership of OT security coordination in many cases. So we all know that there's a huge worldwide shortage of qualified security staff. And I mean, it's like 1 million people we have shortfalls. And I was talking to someone that's been in the OT space for a long time. His opinion is that in the world, there are fewer than 1,000 people that really know OT security well. Now, I can't defend that number, but the point is there aren't a lot of people that do that really well. And so we're seeing the OT folks looking at the IT folks for guidance. And that goes back to one of the things I hoped you'd take away from this is some of the alignment between the IT folks and the OT folks. I've talked to people that they've tried to bridge that gap, and they've done some interesting things. One of the things that was really easy to do is they would have every other week a brown bag lunch and learn sort of thing, where someone would bring in pizza, they'd get people from staff on the OT side, the IT side together, and they would talk and make sure that they understood each other's constraints and each other's requirements. So that's something that you can easily do. And then on the prior side, I talked about only 20% have sufficient visibility into their attack surface. And this one says security teams in converging IT and OT organizations have limited visibility into OT assets. Full inventories do not exist. And when I've talked to people at conferences, sometimes I'll ask for a show of hands. We've done it on some webinars and ask them, how many of you really know what's out there in the OT environment? We did one where we had it was a webinar, so it's not statistically, valid sampling and all of that stuff. But we asked them in a polling question, how many felt they had 100% visibility? I think there were about 300 people who answered. None of them felt that they had 100% visibility. In fact, it was really down around maybe they thought they knew maybe 40, 50, 60% of what they had. So that is a big problem. So another thing, going back to this alignment, this is from data from SANS, and I think it's 2017, it could be 2018. But basically, they said, who sets the policies for security of control systems? And most of the time, it's IT people that are setting the policies. And then you ask, who has the responsibility for implementing the controls? And most of the time, it's the OT folks. And the reason I mention that is that's where you have a classic disconnect. Somebody's setting the policy, they think that it's being followed because they've communicated, they've pointed out the book, they've sent the PDF, whatever it happens to be, the PowerPoint slides, and they think that the OT folks are implementing it. And oftentimes, they aren't. And oftentimes there's the thought, remember I talked about how active scanning brought down that PLC? So you could have a policy that says, scan your networks, I'm going to make this up, every 3 weeks, and if you find critical or high vulnerabilities, remediate them within 2 weeks. So that could be the policy. And the OT guys look at that and they say, no way. I'm not going to scan my network because scanning could cause an outage, and I can't have an outage. So that's the type of things that can cause these disconnects, and that means that you need to find a way to work together. And that brings me to my next slide, is start with a common framework. And as we'll see, I don't want to get into details about control objectives, but the idea, if you have control objectives, these are things you're trying to accomplish with your controls, you'll find that they can apply across IT and OT pretty well. It's the way you implement those controls that have to change. And my philosophy is that in order to manage this converged IT-OT attack surface, you need to extend the IT processes and the IT controls. You have to adapt them, certainly. But my feeling is that in most cases, the IT security people are more mature. They've got better processes in place. So a process could be how we manage our vulnerabilities, how we decide, how we prioritize them, how we decide if we're going to remediate them. Now, of course, that's going to have to be modified when you look at the OT world. But in many cases, they have some of these processes in place. And as Gartner said, they tend to have more experience, more expertise, and they can bring the OT folks along. So that's kind of my thought, is that you extend those those IT processes and controls. And now we're going to change and talk about the Center for Internet Security. How many of you have heard of the SANS Top 20 list? All right, you're kind of dating yourself because they don't call it that anymore. But there's an organization called the Center for Internet Security, and if you want more information, I can give it to you later. But they're a very prestigious organization, and they have a prioritized list of 20 controls. They're on version 7 of that list right now, so it's always being updated. And the reason I like these controls, there are a couple of reasons. One is they're pretty prescriptive. In addition to the 20 controls that you can't read about, but I'll zero in on some later, each one of those has, I think, between 5 and 13 or 14 subcontrols. So you can really get some pretty detailed guidance about what you're going to do. So I like the fact that they're detailed. They're also cross-referenced to just about everything else, so in this cybersecurity framework and other things. But the next thing I like about it is they're prioritized. So they're telling you, do number 1 first, and A, you're going to get the most bang for the buck for that. You're going to get the most return, and B, subsequent controls are going to build on top of that. So I think it's a very good place to start. And they have them broken down in version 7 into 3 categories: basic and foundational, and then organizational. And we're going to zero in on the 6 basic controls here. And starting at the bottom, since it's a foundation and we're working our way up, the first one is inventory and control of hardware assets. And basically that means you have to know what you have, you have to know what you're supposed to have, what's authorized, and you need to get rid of anything that's not authorized. So the second control is very much like that, only it's around software. Know what you have, and if it's not authorized, excuse me, get rid of it. And the third one is continuous vulnerability management. So at this point, with number 1 and 2, you've got only authorized things on your network. And then with number 3, you know that vulnerabilities are being discovered all the time. So make sure that you're removing those vulnerabilities in a timely way. Then the fourth one, and this one moved into number 4 with version 7. I think it was number 5 previously, but it's controlled use of administrative privileges. And that's making sure that those privileged accounts, the admin accounts that have so much power associated with them, are very tightly controlled, because if somebody gets access to those who shouldn't, they can do a lot of nasty things. Excuse me, the fourth one is secure configurations for hardware and software on computers. And so what they mean here is make sure that, for example, you've got strong authentication controls, strong password controls, that you're not running services that you shouldn't be running on the systems. If you don't need it to run FTP, it shouldn't be running FTP. And by the way, there are lots of standards out there that you can use to, you don't have to make this up yourself. The CIS, the STIGs, and other organizations have good standards for that. Excuse me. So once you've done 1 through 5, you can think about how you've kind of hardened your attack surface. You know what it is. You've gotten rid of the vulnerabilities. You're not running things you shouldn't be on it. You've locked down those admin accounts. And then number 6 is maintenance and monitoring and analysis of audit logs, which I'm not saying you shouldn't do that earlier, but I think that the advantage is when you get things locked down, you're going to have fewer things that are strange going on there to investigate. So you're going to be much more efficient. So these are the basic controls that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And I do want to mention that in, I don't know, it was probably middle of last year, they published a guide that's called the Implementation Guide for Industrial Security Controls. And that guide basically takes their 20 controls and it goes through and says, all right, if you want to apply these control objectives into an operational technology environment, here are some considerations that you ought to be looking at. Some things that, so for example, I've talked about, my example's been active scanning. They'll say, yeah, not so much. Do passive monitoring instead. And there's some guidance like that that they provide. So that's available on their website. By the way, 2 people, including myself from Tenable, contributed to that. So, I'm pretty familiar with it, and I think it's a pretty useful place, if nothing else, to have the discussion. So I talked about getting the IT folks and the OT folks together and getting alignment. I think if you have a document like this and you talk through it, you might say, might have some disagreement, but you've got something concrete to start talking about and seeing where you can build that common ground. So I've got several slides now where I'm talking about selected subcontrols. So I mentioned that each one of these controls has 5 to 12 or 13 subcontrols. I've just pulled out a few here, and on the selected subcontrols section, we're really talking about the IT controls. And then there are selected ICS considerations. And those are the things that they're saying you might want to do this a little bit different if you apply this in the OT environment. So for selected subcontrols, they'll talk about using an active discovery tool. An active tool will basically, it's a scanner, it goes out on the network. You can give it a range of IP addresses if you want to and say, go through each one of these IP addresses, see if you get a response back. And if you do, then go through all 65,000 ports and see what ports are open. That's very useful, but it can cause problems with OT equipment, as I've talked about. Kind of as an aside, NERC-CEP, or NERC-CIP, however you want to pronounce it, is a standard that North American electric utilities are held to. One of their requirements is that you do know what ports are open. So open doesn't mean active. So you really have to do this active scanning to see that. So an example would be, do this during the shutdown. Don't do this on a live system, but you've got to, generate reports showing that these ports are open or they're not open, and you'll do that with active scanning. So it's not all don't use active scanning, only use passive scanning. A lot of it is be very careful. If you really need to use active scanning, do it during a shutdown, or if you think back about that Purdue model where we had the more OT-specific devices down lower, make sure that you're doing the passive down on the PLCs and all of that stuff, and then you can carefully move up, and you have to test. And it's hard to test because it's not always, you can't just take a device, put it in a lab, and scan it and say, oh, it didn't have any disruption of it, therefore it's safe to do the active scanning, because active scanning also uses network resources. And so it can slow down the responsiveness of the network. You might not be causing a problem with the device, but you could be causing a problem with the network, slow things down. And a lot of these OT environments are very real time, and they cannot handle that delay. Kind of a little aside, I was talking to a guy, and he spent a lot of time in OT, and we were talking about the sensitivity of the network. And he said, we upgraded the network cards in some of our systems, and we were upgrading. I mean, it was going from older to newer, and that upgrade caused the network to fail. It was just barely, it was on the edge before they made a change to it, and it was causing a problem. So in terms of active scanning, don't just think about the potential impact on the device, think about the potential impact on the network as well. So I talked about that a long time, but they say active discovery tool. They also say use a passive discovery tool. And the advantage, the reason they suggest a passive tool, even on the IT side, is that active scanning is scheduled. You might do it, rarely will people do it daily. Most people, from what I've seen, do it about monthly. And so you've got time in between scans where you're not sure if something new is coming on the network. But if you have passive monitoring on the network that's always watching that network traffic, something new gets added to the network and you're going to see it. That's also why they say look at the DHCP, because hopefully it'll be handing out an address and there'll be a record in the DHCP log of something new coming on the network. So their selected ICS considerations are use passive methods to locate connected assets. That's the preferred approach. And I would certainly agree with that you want to start out with passive. And then another thing they say is just follow approved processes for equipment modifications and acquisitions. That's basically saying have a good change management system. And the advantage of an OT environment over an IT environment is they tend to be fairly static. IT things are coming off and on the network all the time. OT is much less that way. So you really do need to have a change management system and follow it. And this is a whole nother discussion, but I'm trying to remember the ITIL categories. There's I can't remember the name of the first two. I know the third one's the emergency, and one's standard and whatever. But in the IT world, there are changes that don't need to go through the change advisory board. Like applying patches to a Windows machine. Oftentimes that's just, we're just going to do it. We're not going to do exhaustive testing of it. In the OT world, I would recommend that you test everything so that everything needs to go through that change management board and be reviewed to make sure it's not going to cause a problem. The good news is there are fewer changes. So that's the inventory and control of hardware assets. I was just going to say, this is not very big, but there are products. Tenable has some where we can show you, this is a passive monitoring product. We'll look at that traffic. We can say, this is a PLC, this is the manufacturer, and in many cases we can say the model number associated with that. So that's having a real-time inventory that's obviously useful for security, but also can help you with the operational side. So let's look at inventory and control of software assets. It's very similar in some ways, although they talk about application whitelisting. But again, if we look down at this selected ICS considerations, it says large parts of ICS networks are comprised of devices too sensitive to scan. We've already talked about that, but just reiterating it. And they say use application whitelisting where available. There's some difficulty sometimes around doing that because you've got to keep your whitelist up to date and so on. But there are some things you can do to make sure that you're not getting nasty stuff installed on your network. And so this is kind of what it can look like. You can see the application details, what the application is, what ports it's using, and so on. Apologize for those being so small. Then the third is the continuous vulnerability management. And they say run automated vulnerability scanning tools. Again, they're saying do the scanning, but if you look down at the ICS considerations, they're saying scanning should only take place during maintenance shutdowns. And I would agree with that totally, unless you're in the upper layers and you've done some testing and you know that that can withstand the scanning. So they say use an OEM vulnerability reporting service. There are lots of services out there. If you can identify a device and its make and model and version number, you can look it up and find out if there's a vulnerability on it. In fact, there are tools like ours that will do that automatically for you. It says utilize passive monitoring tools that correlate known vulnerabilities, and that's just what I was talking about. One of the things I want to mention that's an advantage in the OT environment, when you use the passive tools, they're giving you that information consistently, continuously, all along. So if you use an active scanning tool and you only do that during a maintenance shutdown, typically the maintenance shutdowns are as short as they can be, and they're very busy. You typically don't get everything done that you'd like to do. You have to prioritize, do the most important things first. So if you're waiting to know what vulnerabilities you have until you run an active scan during that maintenance window, it's doubtful whether you're going to be able to prioritize those and come up with remediation for it that can be implemented during that same maintenance window. So you're always kind of behind the 8 ball there. If you're using the passive vulnerability detection, to be honest, you don't have the depth of visibility you would have with active, but you've got good visibility, and prior to the maintenance window, you can do some of the prioritization. And maybe, let's just say you want to put things in 3 different categories. This is a critical problem, this is a medium one, and this is not such a big deal. So the critical ones you might need to take care of before the maintenance window. And that doesn't always mean patching. It could be doing something like changing firewall rules. If you find out that there's a service that's vulnerable on that device and you don't really need it, you can block it. You can also perhaps do additional monitoring around it. Change your SIM rules so that you're looking for, this got a critical vulnerability on it. If anything strange is happening around that device, I want to know about it and we need to investigate it. So for those very critical things, you can take some action prior to the maintenance window. And then let's say you've got the medium level things. Those are the things that you can prioritize and hopefully take care of during the maintenance window. The low priority things, we never get to everything, so you might not get to those as well. But that's an example of how you can use the passive vulnerability analysis tools to give you a head start on your maintenance window. And I'll go back to that, but basically there are tools out there, including ours, that can go through and find the vulnerabilities for you. And there is the common vulnerability scoring system, if you happen to be familiar with that. It's an industry-wide thing, and they score vulnerabilities between 0 and 10.0, basically. And I think anything above a 7 is a high, and above that is a critical. But one of the neat things about that is that they have what they call vectors, or the score is made up of subcomponents. And so if you want to, I said, how you want to find out if something's really critical, you could drill into those vulnerabilities and say, is the impact of this vulnerability, is it an outage? If it is, then that might be a higher priority. Some of them, they'll give you some information about how accessible do you have to be. Do you have to be at the device? Can you be on the network? How are you going to access this thing? So there are lots of little details in there that you could look at and filter on to help you make that determination of what are the most critical vulnerabilities you need to go in and maybe take some corrective action on. So you don't have to rely just on the vulnerability scores. Okay, controlled use of admin privileges. And they talk about maintaining an inventory of admin accounts, changing default passwords, using dedicated admin accounts, and so on. But then the selected ICS considerations, they say when inventorying admin accounts, use automated tools only if known not to impact availability. We've kind of talked about that. And use dedicated machines or the use of isolation for admin. It says using dedicated machines or isolation for admin machines may not apply. So the admin rights are pretty risky, particularly if they're not used correctly. And one of the things that I've seen is that in many OT environments, it's very common for them to be working with a vendor. Maybe it's Siemens, maybe it's somebody else that's helped them design their systems. Oftentimes they have contracts with them where they're doing maintenance of them. And oftentimes they have access, and not just the outside third party, but even the people that are home on Friday night or the weekend. If they need to have access and check something out, there are typically ways they can log in and get into those networks. And those credentials need to be very carefully managed. You should make sure that they're not your people that are accessing like that from the outside aren't doing it on the same machine that they're looking at Facebook and all of that stuff, surfing the web. So there's some things you can do. It's going to maybe cost you some money to have some additional machines and controls around that, but I think it's well worth it to do that. And then secure configurations for computers. And I mentioned there are standards out there. The ICS considerations are consider OEM and vendor recommendations. So for all of the common IT things like all of the Windows machines and Linux machines, all the different variants, for middleware, for email, for databases. There are configuration standards that you can use. In the case of PLCs, things like that, not so much, but you can work with the vendor and have them help you decide what needs to be enabled, what shouldn't be enabled there. And again, disable all unused ports and services, change default passwords, update protocols. I was at a conference, when was it? It was April of last year. And one of the speakers was the type of expert that if there's a breach, they bring this person in and he investigates it and works with the FBI and all of that stuff. And he was using Shodan, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but basically that's a website you can go to and it will show you public-facing systems. And he found a dam, a hydroelectric dam, and I can't remember what state it is, but let's say Arkansas, because I think it might have been Arkansas. And it was wide open. I mean, you could get in and open the spillway if you wanted to. And so he contacted the CIO, basically, and said, hey, you know, I'm going to be doing a talk at this conference, and I've noticed this is open. I want to give you a heads up so you can close it down. And the guy says, well, I'm sure that it's not open. And he says, well, talk to your technical people. Here's my contact information. Talk to them. They'll agree with me, and then close it down and call me back. So 2 weeks later, he hadn't heard from the guy, so he called him back. And he said, hey, what's the status of this? It's still wide open. And they said, no, my guys assured me it's not wide open. So he popped up a browser and he opened it. And there were buttons like open spillway. You could hit it with your mouse, close spillway, and that was all exposed. So I'm kind of rambling on here, but make sure that things are really configured securely, that your network's configured securely so that people can't get in and do that kind of stuff. It's kind of fun to look at in the conference, but it's really scary in real life. So the last thing here is maintenance and monitoring of these audit logs. And it says gathering organizational information from logs may not apply. SubControls related to aggregating and storing log data may not apply. And if you use a SIM, ensure that it supports ICS-specific events. And that's very true. You're going to probably have to tune your SIM a little bit. But the good news is there's so much equipment out there that is going to be feeding information into your SIM or into your log management system and recording that this is really important. The problem with it is that automated rules only take you so far. You really need some people to go in from time to time and really look through the logs and saying, is something strange happening here? So it can be manpower intensive. Okay, I want to just hit a couple of other things. One is that, and I know you can't read this, but I've taken these 6 basic controls we've just talked through on the left, and I've shown how they can correlate to, in this case, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or NERC version 7. And the takeaway from this slide is if you do these 6 things, no matter what you need to do in terms of other security frameworks, in terms of regulatory requirements, what you've started with these things will apply. It's not like you're going this way when you really want to be going this way. You're going the same direction, and it is, in my opinion, a very good way to start. And then this is some research that Tenable did in 2016 and 2017. So it's a little bit old, a couple years old, but we did it in conjunction with the Center for Internet Security. And back then, they had 5, instead of a list of 6, they had 5 controls, and they called them the foundational controls. And they're a little bit different here. But basically, we asked people, have you automated these? And the key takeaway is that fewer than 50% of the organizations had automated these controls. And that it didn't get better when you went from 2016 to 2017. In fact, in some cases, it went down. But it went down a small enough amount that was really in the margin of error. We can't say it definitely went down. But the reason I say this, if you're in a situation where you're not doing these basic things, you're not alone, but that's not an excuse. It's not an excuse to not do anything. And we also asked some questions about what are the implementation or the impediments to adopting some of these controls. And we grouped them into 2 categories, organizational and technical. And I just want to talk about the top one in each one of these. The top one is lack of trained staff. And we already talked about that. But there are consultants out there that you can use that can help you with this. I know it costs money, but it might be the best way to get some of this started. Another thing that was kind of significant, 23%, is actually the lowest one there, but the lack of budget and then lack of management support. And the reason I mention lack of management support, if you're going to get started, make sure you have management support because it's going to take resources to do this. And then if we look at the technical, the number one thing is lack of integration among tools. And I think that's especially germane when you're talking about IT and OT, because if you have separate tools that you're looking at the same overall converged initiative and you can't correlate things together, then you've got some real blind spots that you're going to need to find some way to overcome. So keep that in mind. And that, we have 5 minutes left, and I was planning to leave some time for questions. So if anyone's still awake and have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. If not, you get done 5 minutes early. All right, thank you very much.